This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I have a real fascination with obscure Star Wars characters. And today we're going to be painting up what has got to be the most obscure character in the Star Wars Shatterpoint core set, Gar Saxon in the Mandalorian Super Commandoes. Once referred to as the Mandalorian Starscream by Falxcafer95 in the comments section of a Star Wars Explained video, Gar is a bootlicker through and through and frequently finds himself as the second in command of whatever bad guy is currently in power. And much like the other Shatterpoint figures that I've painted up so far, I'm going to be painting up both Gar Saxon and the other two Mauldalorians, aiming for that sketchy Clone Wars style paint job that we've been doing with the rest of the figures. For base coating the face, I used that same dark burgundy color that I used for a lot of the other characters' base skin tone, thinning it down so that it will seep into the recesses. And I then used a thinned down warm black color to paint his hair. I even used this warm black to base coat the stubble on his face and the shaved down parts of his hair along the back of his head, as well as giving him a little bit more shadow under the eyes. Because I already had some thinned down warm black on my brush around this point, I also thought I would base coat all of the clothing and armor in this color, as Gar is pretty much entirely decked out in gray and black clothing with just a few red highlights. But after applying just a little bit of this, I realized it wasn't the right color of gray. His clothing is more of a cool gray. So while I gave some thought to which color to paint his armor and clothing with, I continued working on his face. Because Gar has a bit of a reddish pink undertone to his skin, I thought I would try something new and mix a little bit of the brand new Viejo game color fluorescent pink into the base tan/khaki color that I've been using for a lot of the other Caucasian skin tones in this set so far. This color is pretty potent, so I only had to add just a tiny bit to the mixture to get the skin tone I was looking for. After thinning down this color with some water, I carefully applied it to all of the raised parts of the face, taking care to leave lots of dark red in the recesses, and I even applied this over top of the shaved down black hair around the back of his head, using a dabbing motion to sell the stubble effect. After this, I tried to remember the lessons I taught myself on previous Shatterpoint figures, and decided to paint the eyes on early and up front to save me some effort later. I applied a single dot of white to give the impression that he's looking slightly to the left, and then I totally messed up on the second eye. Note to self, I probably shouldn't have attached the shield yet at this point because it makes it a lot harder to paint this side of the face. I then applied some black around the eyes to do his eyeliner, took a few attempts to correct his left eye off camera, applied a filter of burgundy to make his eye look a little bit more natural, and then used the same color to apply his lipstick, and I even tried to reapply some of his prominent forehead wrinkles with this color. I then added just a little bit of warm white to the base skin tone, and applied some highlights on the raised areas of the face with this color. For his hair, I mixed up a gray using warm white and cool black, and applied this to all of his hair, leaving just small amounts of black in the recesses. And I then mixed up some of this gray with our skin tone highlight color to both highlight his hair as well as painting all of the hair stubble on both the sides and back of his head, as well as his beard stubble. And just a tiny amount around his eyebrow area to suggest some gray eyebrows. After this, I added just a tiny bit more warm white to the stubble mixture and used this color to give his hair a final highlight using some rough brush strokes, and I used just a bit of this color as well to dab on some subtle stubble texture in a few places. Trying not to overdo it, but I just wanted to add a little bit of texture for variety. And with this, I'm mostly going to consider the face painting done. Next up is the question of how to paint the mostly black and gray armor. There are a ton of ways we could tackle this, but in this specific situation, where I want a lighter gray for some of the clothing and a darker black for the armor on top, here is the method I came up with. Step 1. I applied a coat of Speed Paint 2.0 Gravelord Gray over everything. While waiting the requisite 10 minutes for this to dry to prevent any reactivation, I painted the other two of Gar's friends as well in this color. Step 2. After 10 minutes, I used a warm black to paint all of the armor panels, once again in that sketchy Clone Wars style, to make the armor panels look darker than the clothing. Step 3. After this, I mixed up a warm red and a cool red to get the perfect medium red to paint all of the red markings on the armor. I tried my best to keep this a bit rough to make it look like Gar had painted it on himself, and I also painted all of the piping on his uniform in this color as well as per his appearance in the TV show. I may have failed to paint inside the lines at some places, but as you'll see, we're going to clean that up later. Step 4. As I was painting on the red markings, I soon realized that the black armor didn't look different enough from the gray clothing that Gar was wearing under the armor, so after I finished with the red parts, I went in with a darker, more primary black to repaint all of the armor panels, and I also used this opportunity to clean up any of the places where I failed to keep the red paint inside of the lines, and darken some of the clothing in places where it's supposed to be black, not gray. Next up, we get to the fun part, adding a bunch of highlights, weathering, and details. But you know what's also the fun part? This video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using for over a decade now for all of my website needs. You just pick from one of their gorgeous pre-designed templates, add in any pages or extra features you might want, and then customize things to your heart's content using their incredibly intuitive drag-and-drop grid system. No coding or technical knowledge required. Over the past year, I've been using my current Squarespace website to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painted reference documents, and I've been really happy with it so far. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial? And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. For the glowing yellow parts on his armor, I base coated them with white and then painted them with yet another Vallejo Express color that I haven't tried yet, Imperial Yellow. I didn't make any effort to stay inside the lines with this, as I want the color to spill over just a little bit onto his chest and give a glow effect. This worked pretty well, so I decided to use the same color to start painting the jetpack effects as well. For the jetpack rocket effect, I painted it sort of like a reverse campfire or torch, starting with white and yellow at the source, and moving outwards towards orange, red, and finally gray smoke towards the end of the trail. But instead of using all those colors, I simply painted all the parts that I wanted to have color first with yellow, and then added successive amounts of fluorescent pink as the trail got lower and lower to the ground. If you haven't seen my CMYK video, yellow can form different shades of orange and red the more magenta that you add in. So I took advantage of this and glazed on successive layers of yellow and fluorescent pink to get a gradient that I liked, making sure to leave some of the smoke clouds just gray with some colored shadows. I then re-highlighted some of the areas near the base of the rocket with my brightest white color, and overall I think this worked pretty well for a quick jetpack look. For the personal combat shield, I decided to try out yet another new color from the Vallejo game color range, fluorescent blue. I slapped on a few coats of this, and at this point I'm really starting to think these new fluorescent colors should really be considered Vallejo Express color paints instead of game color paints, as they have a similar consistency and that same desire to sink into the recesses of things. Overall, I quite like these fluorescent paints so far, and I'll be sure to mention them in my full review of the Vallejo Express color range if and when I ever get around to doing that. Next, I added some bright white highlights to the shield in a few places, and then added in the proper highlights for the rest of the figure. For these highlights, I mixed some primary black and white, and mostly just used the edge of my brush to highlight the armor. Once again, attempting to mimic the style of the show, and just adding these little highlights where the paint has seemingly worn off and the raw Beskar armor can be seen underneath. I also used this color to paint some of the more shiny metallic parts on the figure, such as the belt buckle, the gun, and I even added some soft highlights to the gray under armor with this gray as well. I spent quite some time roughly highlighting this figure in this sketchy way, adding all sorts of details and scuffs and dents. And if you can't tell, I quite enjoy this part of the painting process, so much so that I may have gone a bit far with it in some places, and I ended up going back in with both red and black paint to do a little bit of cleanup later in places where the chipping was a bit too much. Should I be using a brush with a finer tip for this process? Yes, probably, but there's always next time. Overall, I feel pretty happy with this result. It's a nice 2-hour paint job. I could probably smooth out the blends a bit more in places, but that's sort of counterintuitive to the style we're going for. So let's move on to Gar's two friends, the Mandalorian Super Commandoes. So for the Mandalorian Super Commandoes, I used a very similar paint job to Gar Saxon. Earlier, we already gave these a single thick coat of Gravelord Gray as a starting point, and the nice thing about these two is that they don't represent any specific character in the show. Rather, they represent two of a vast group of Mandos who all painted their armor slightly differently. So I used two of the background characters as reference, but didn't feel it necessary to stick too closely to the exact details of either one. And yes, I did consider painting the Lady Mando to look like Rook Cast, but upon closer examination, Rook's armor is actually pretty specific and pretty different than this sculpt. And it also wouldn't surprise me if we get a specific sculpt for Rook Cast in the future, so I just painted these two Mandalorians to look like random Mauldalorians. Unlike Gar Saxon, these two seem to have a darker undersuit with red and light gray armor, or maybe it's not light gray, maybe it's just unpainted Beskar on top. So this color scheme is the inverse of what we did for Gar. And this was actually quite a bit easier to do. I just used my darkest black to paint both of their undersuits, as well as a few black details on their armor. After this, I went in with a cool red and painted all the red parts of the armor. And notably, I didn't mix the cool and warm red together like I did for Gar, as the Super Commandos seem to have a slightly cooler red on their armor compared to Mr. Saxon. I did my best to follow the color schemes from the background characters in Season 7, Episode 9, Old Friends Not Forgotten for these two, but I also took a little bit of artistic license in places as well. As, like I said before, it seems like all of these Mandos paint their armor slightly differently to personalize it, so we can really do whatever we want here. For the skirt of the kneeling Mando, I decided to vary things up a bit and use some of our burgundy color that we used for the undertone for Gar's face to paint her skirt. This was sort of inspired by the reference Mando from the TV show that I was using for paint reference, as she seems to have a darker, almost black-red color for this skirt thing, and I quite like how it breaks up the other colors a little bit. In fact, I liked it so much that I actually went back in and added bits of this burgundy color on both of the Super Commandos. In some places, I used this to just add a little bit of shading or texture to the parts that were already red, and in other places, I used it to paint little straps or other details. For the highlights, I used a similar technique to Gar Saxon, using various shades of gray that were already on my palette to edge highlight the details of the armor in places where the paint would most likely rub off. Finally, I added the glowing triangles to our kneeling Mando friend in the same way as Gar Saxon, and then I freehanded on this hand or claw print thing. I'm not entirely sure what this signifies, but it seems like a lot of the Super Commandos have this mark on their helmet. For the bases, I did my best to match the colors up with the playmat that I'm hoping to play most of my Shatterpoint games on, using both warm and cool gray shades to paint the panels and my darkest black to fill in the recesses and rim the bases. As a final optional step, I added a few subtle sprays of cyan and magenta from my airbrush to a few places on the figures, mostly on the bases, to mimic the neon lighting that I want my Shatterpoint board to have. And that's about it. If you're still here and you watched the video all the way to the end, feel free to leave a comment down in the description to let me know which Star Wars character, or just which miniature in general, you'd like to see me paint next in a more detailed tutorial like this, which I don't do as often anymore. As always, thank you so much to our generous patrons who continue to keep this channel running. If you'd like to join our Discord server, see your name down in the credits, or just to help fund longer tutorials like this, you can do so over at patreon.com/DanaHowl. I should also mention that these specific miniatures were provided free for review purposes from Atomic Mass Games. And if you'd like them to send me more Star Wars miniatures for review, you can do so by clicking the link down in the description that goes to their website and tells them that you heard about it from me, from my video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.